Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 14 of our reading of The Last Unicorn. In the last episode, we basically found out more about, we actually found out where the unicorns are. King Haggard basically told Lady Amalthea where the unicorns were, but she's still kind of out of her head. So, I don't know what she's going to do about it. But anyways, I think that we stopped before we had a chance for her to actually respond to this news. So we are going to go this. Nearby, Prince Lear sang, "Others may offer more than they can give, all that they have for as long as they live." The Lady Amalthea closed her hands on the parapet and wished for him to come to her, for she knew now that King Haggard was mad. Below them lay the thin, shallow beach and the rocks and the rising tide, and nothing more. "I like to watch them. They fill me with joy." The childish voice was all but singing. "I am sure it is joy. The first time I felt it, I thought I was going to die." There were two of them in the early morning shadows. One was drinking from the stream, and the other was resting her head on his back. "I thought I was going to die. I said to the Red Bull, I must have that. I must have all of it. All there is, for my need is very great." So the bull caught them one by one. It was all the same to the bull. It would not have been the same if I had demanded tumblebergs or crocodiles. He can only tell the difference between what I want and what I do not want. He had forgotten her for the moment as he leaned over the low wall, and she might have fled the tower then, but she stayed where she was, for an old bad dream was waking all around her. Though it was daylight, the tide shattered on the rocks and tumbled together again, and Prince Lear rode along singing, "But I will love you and as long as I can, and never ask if you love me." "I suppose I was young when I first saw them," King Haggard said. "Now I must be old. At least I have picked many more things up than I had then, and put them all down again. But I always knew that nothing was worth the investment of my heart, because nothing lasts, and I was right, and so I was always old. Yet each time I see my unicorns is like that morning in the woods, and I am truly young in spite of myself, and anything can happen in a world that holds much beauty." In the dream, I looked down at 4 white legs and felt the earth under split hooves. There was a burning on my brow, as there is now, but there were no unicorns coming in on the tide. "The king is mad," he said. "I wonder what will become of them when I am gone. The Red Bull will forget them immediately, I know, and be off to find a new master. But I wonder if they will take their freedom even then. I hope not, for then they will belong to me forever." Then he turned to look at her again, and his eyes were as gentle and greedy as Prince Lear's eyes became when he looked at her. "You are the last," he said. "The bull missed you because you were shaped like a woman. But I always knew. How did you manage the change, by the way? Your magician couldn't have done it. I don't think he could turn cream into butter." If she had let go of the parapet, she would have fallen, but she answered him quite calmly, "My lord, I do not understand. I see nothing at all in the water." The king's face shriveled, as though she were looking at him through fire. "Do you still deny yourself?" he whispered. "Do you dare deny yourself? Nay, that's a false and cowardly, as though you were truly human. I'll hurl you down to your folk with my own hands if you deny yourself." He took a step towards her, and she watched him with eyes open, unable to move. The tumult of the sea filled her head together with Prince Lear's singing and the blubbering death wail of the man named Rook. King Haggard's gray face hung over her like a hammer, muttering, "It must be so. I cannot be mistaken. Yet her eyes are as stupid as his, as any eyes that never saw unicorns, never saw anything but themselves in the glass. What cheat is this? How can it be? There are no green leaves in your eyes now." Then she did close her eyes, but she shut in more than she kept out. The bronze-winged creature, with a hag's face, swung by, laughing and prattling, and the butterfly folded its wings to strike. The red bull moved silently through the forest, pushing the bare branches aside with his pale horns. She knew when King Haggard went away, but she did not open her eyes. It was long after, or only a little while later, that she heard the magician's voice behind her. Be still, it's over." She had not known that she was making any sound. In the sea," he said, "in the sea. Well, don't feel too bad about it. I didn't see them either, not this time or any other. That I've stood here and watched the tide coming in, but he saw them. And if Haggard sees something, it's there." He laughed with a sound like an axe falling on wood. "Don't feel bad. This is a witch castle, and it's hard to look closely at things living here. It's not enough to be ready to see what you have to be looking all the time." He laughed again, more gently. "All right," he said. "We'll find them now. Come on. Come with me." She turned to him, moving her mouth to make sounds, but no words came out. The magician was studying her face with his green eyes. "Your face is wet," he said worriedly. "I hope that's spray. If you're becoming human enough to cry, then no magic in the world. Oh, it must be spray. Come with me. It had better be spray." We are to chapter 12. I have to remember my Roman numerals. In the great hall of King Haggard's castle, the clock struck 6. Actually, it was 11 minutes past midnight, but the hall was a little darker than it had been at 6 o'clock or at noon. Yet those who lived in the castle told time by the difference in the dark. There were hours when the hall was cold simply for want of warmth, and gloomy for lack of light, when the air was stale and still, and the stones stank of old water because there was no window to let the souring wind to let in the scouring wind. That was daytime. But at night, as some trees hold a living light all day, hold it with the underside of their leaves until long after sundown, so at night the castle was charged and swarming with darkness, alive with darkness. Then the great hall was cold for a reason. Then the small sounds that kept by day woke up to patter and scratch in the corners. It was night when the old smell of the stones seemed to rise from below the floor. Light a light, Molly Grew said. "Please, can you make a light?" Spindrick muttered something curt and professional. For a moment nothing happened, but then a strange sallow brightness began to spread over the floor, scattering itself about the room in 1,000 scurrying shards that shone and squeaked. The little night beasts of the castle were glowing like fireflies. They darted here and there in the hall, raising swift shadows with their sickly light and making the darkness even colder than before. "I wish you hadn't done that," Molly said. "Can you turn them off again? The purple ones, anyway." With the legs, I guess." "No, I can't," Smidrick answered crossly. "Be quiet. Where's the skull?" Lady Amalthea could see it grinning from a pillar, lemon small in the shadows and dim as the morning moon. But she said nothing. She had not spoken since she came down from the tower. "There," the magician said. He strode to the skull and peered into its split and crumbling eye sockets for a long time, nodding slowly and making solemn sounds to himself. Molly Grew stared with equal earnestness, but she glanced often at the Lady Amalthea, and at last Smindrick said, "All right, don't stand so close." "Are there really spells to make a skull speak?" Molly asked. The magician stretched out his fingers and gave her a small, competent smile. "There are spells to make everything speak. The master wizards were great listeners, and they devised ways to charm all things of the world, living and dead, into talking to them. That is most of it, being a wizard, seeing and listening." He drew a long breath, suddenly looking away and rubbing his hands together. "The rest is technique," he said. "Well, here we go." Abruptly he turned to face the skull, put one hand lightly on the pale crown, and addressed it in a deep, commanding voice. The words marched out of his mouth like soldiers, their steps echoing with power as they crossed the dark air, but the skull made no answer at all. "I just wondered," the magician said softly. He lifted his hand from the skull and spoke to it again. This time the sound of the spell was reasonable and cajoling, almost plaintive. The skull remained silent, but it seemed to Molly that a wakefulness slipped across the faceless front and was gone again. In the scuttling light of the radiant vermin, the Lady Amalthea's hair shone like a flower, appearing neither interested nor indifferent, but quite in the way that a battlefield is sometimes quiet. She watched as Smindrick recited one incantation after another to a desert-colored knob of bone that spoke not one word more than she did. Each charm was uttered in a more despairing tone than the last. The skull would not speak, and yet Molly grew as certain that it was aware and listening and amused. She knew the silence of mockery too well to mistake it for death. The clock struck 29, at least it was at that point that Molly lost count. The rusted strokes were still clanging to the floor, when Smindrick suddenly shook both fists at the skull and shouted, all right, for you, you pretentious kneecap. How would you like a punch in the eye?" On the last word, his voice unraveled completely into a snarl of misery and rage. "That's right," the skull said. "Yell, wake up old Haggard." Its own voice sounded like branches creaking and knocking together in the wind. "Yell louder," it said. "The old man's probably around here somewhere. He doesn't sleep much." Molly gave a small cry of delight, and even the Lady Amalthea moved a step nearer. Smindrick stood with his fists shut and no triumph in his face. The skull said, "Come on, ask me how to find the Red Bull. You can't go wrong asking my advice. I'm the king's watchman," said the guard. I'm the king's watchman set to guard the way to the bull. Even Prince Lear doesn't know the secret way, but I do." A little timidly, Molly Grew asked, "If you are truly on guard here, why don't you give the alarm? Why do you offer to help us instead of summoning the men-at-arms?" The skull gave a rattling chuckle. "I've been up on this pillar a long time," it said. "I was Haggard's chief henchman once, until he smote off my head for no reason. That was back in the day when he was being wicked, you see. If that was what he really liked to do. It wasn't, but he thought he might as well get some use out of the head, so he stuck it up here to serve as his sentinel. Under the circumstances, I'm not as loyal to King Haggard as I might be." Smindrick spoke spoke in a low voice. "Answer the riddle, then. Tell us the way to the Red Bull." "No," said the skull. Then it laughed like mad. "Why not?" Molly cried furiously. "What kind of game?" The skull's long yellow jaw never moved, but it was some time before the mean laughter chattered to a halt. Even the hurrying night things paused for a moment, stranded in their candy light until it stopped. "I'm dead," said the skull. "I'm dead, and I'm hanging in the dark, watching over Haggard's property. The only small amusement I have is to irk and exasperate the living, and I don't get much of a chance to do that. It's a sad loss, because in life mine was a particularly exasperating nature. You'll pardon me, I'm sure, if I indulge myself with you a little bit." Try me tomorrow. Maybe I'll tell you tomorrow. But we have no time, Molly pleaded. Smendrick nudged her, but she rushed on, stepping close to the skull and appealing directly to its uninhabited eyes. We have no time. We may be too late now. I have time, the skull replied reflectively. It's really not so good to have time. Rush, scramble, desperation. This mist, that left behind, those others too big to fit into such a small space. That's the way life was meant to be. You're supposed to be too late for some things. Don't worry about it. Molly would have entreated further, but the magician gripped her arm and pulled her aside. Be still, he said, in a swift, fierce voice. Not a word, not another word. The darn thing spoke, didn't it? Maybe that's all the riddle requires. It isn't, the skull informed him. I'll talk as much as you like, but I won't tell you anything. That's pretty rotten, isn't it? You should have seen me when I was alive. Smendrick paid no attention. Where's the wine? He demanded to Molly. Let me see what I can do with the wine. I couldn't find any, she said nervously. I looked everywhere, but I don't think there's even a drop in the castle. The magician glared at her in vast silence. I looked, she said. Smendrick raised both arms slowly and let them fall to his sides. Well, he said, well, that's it. Then, if we can't find the wine, I have an illusion, but I can't make wine out of the air. The skull giggled and clacked talky way. Matter can neither be created nor destroyed, it remarked. Not by most magicians, anyways. From a fold of her dress, Molly produced a small flask that gleamed faintly in the darkness. She said, I thought if you had some water to start with. Smendrick and the skull gave her very much the same look. Well, it's been done. What's been done, she said loudly. It's not as though you'd have to make up something new. I'd never ask that of you. Hearing herself, she looked sideways at the Lady Amalthea, but Smendrick took the flask from her hand and studied it thoughtfully, turning it over and murmuring curiously, fragile words to himself, finally said, Why not? As you say, it's a standard trick. There was quite a vogue for it at one time, I remember, but it's really a bit dated these days. He moved one hand slowly over the flask, weaving a word into the air. What are you doing? The skull asked eagerly. Hey, do it closer. Do it over here. I can't see a thing. The magician turned away, holding the flask to his breast and bowing over it. He began a whispery chant that made Molly think of the sound that a dead fire continues to make long after the last coal has faded. You understand, he said, interrupting himself. It won't be anything special. Vin ordinaire, if that. Molly nodded solemnly. Smendrick said, and it's usually too sweet, and how am I supposed to get it to drink itself? I haven't the faintest idea. He took up the incantation again, even more softly, while the skull complained bitterly that it couldn't see or hear anything. Molly said something quiet and hopeful to the Lady Amalthea, who neither looked at her nor replied. The chant stopped abruptly, and Smendrick raised the flask to his lips. He sniffed it at first and muttered, Weak, hardly any bouquet at all. Nobody ever made a good wine by magic. Then he tilted it to drink, then shook it, then stared at it, and then, with a small, horrible smile, turned it over. Nothing ran out, nothing at all. That's done it, Smendrick said almost cheerfully. He touched a dry tongue to his dry lips and repeated, That's done it. That has finally done it. Still smiling, he lifted the flask again and hurled it across the hall. No, wait! Hey, don't! The skull clattering voice protested so wildly that Smendrick halted before the flask left his hand. He and Molly turned together and regarded the skull, which, so great was its anguish, had actually begun to wriggle where it hung, cracking its weary occupant hard against the pillar as it strove to free itself. Don't do that, it wailed. You people must be crazy throwing away wine like that. Give it to me if you don't want it, but don't throw it away. It rocked and lurched on the pillar, whimpering. A dreamy, wandering look crossed Smendrick's face. rather like a rain cloud drifting over dry country. Slowly he asked, "And what use do you have for wine with no tongue to taste it, no ribbly palate to savor it, or gullet to gulp it down? 50 years dead, can it be that you still remember, still desire?" 50 years dead, what else can I do? The skull had ceased its grotesque twitching, but frustration had made its voice almost human. "I remember," it said. "I remember more than wine. Give me a swallow, that's all. Give me a sip, and I'll taste it as you never will. With all your with all your runny flesh, all your buds and organs. I've had time to think. I know what wine is like. Give it to me." Spindrift shook his head, grinning. He said, "Eloquent, but I've been feeling a bit spiteful myself lately." For a third time he lifted the empty flask, and the skull groaned in mortal misery. Out of pity, Molly Grew began to say, "But it isn't." But the magician stepped on her foot. "Of course," he mused aloud, "if you should happen to remember the entrance to the Red Bull's cavern, as well as you remember wine, we might bargain." Yet he twiddled the flask casually between two fingers. "Done," the skull cried instantly. "Done for a dram. But give it to me now. I am more thirsty with thinking of wine than ever I was in life, when I had a throat to be dry. Only give me a single swig now, and I'll tell you anything you want to know." The rusted jaws were beginning to grind sideways on each other. The skull's slaty teeth were trembling and splitting. "Give it to him," Molly whispered to Smindrick. She was terrified that the naked eye sockets might start to fill up with tears, but Smindrick shook his head. I will give it all to you," he said to the skull, "after you tell us how we may find the bull." The skull sighed, but never hesitated. "The way is through the clock," it said. "You simply walk through the clock, and there you are. Now can I have the wine?" Through the clock, the magician turned to peer into the far corner of the great hall where the clock stood. It was tall and black and thin, and the sundown shadow of the clock, the glass over its face, was broken, and the hour hand was gone. Behind gray glass, the works could barely be seen, twitching and turning as fretfully as fish. Smindrick said, "You mean when the clock strikes the right time, it opens, and then there is a tunnel, a hidden stair?" His voice was doubtful, for the clock seemed far too lean to conceal any such passage. "I don't know anything about that," the skull replied. "If you wait for the clock to strike the hour, you'll be here till you're as bald as I am. Why complicate a simple secret? You walk through the clock, and the Red Bull is on the other side. Gimme." "But the cat said," Spindrick began, and then he turned and walked towards the clock. The darkness made him seem to be going away down a hill, growing small and stooped. When he reached the clock, he kept walking without pause, as though it were truly no more than a shadow, and he bumped his nose. "This is stupid," he said coldly to the skull as he returned. How do you think to cheat us? The way to the bull may well lead through the clock, but there is something more to know. Tell me, or I will spill the wine out on the floor for you to remember the smell and look of it as much as you choose. Be quick." But the skull was laughing again, this time making a thoughtful, almost kindly noise. "Remember what I told you about time," it said. "When I was alive, I believed, as you do, that time was at least as real and solid as myself, and probably more so. I said 1 o'clock as though I could see it, and Monday as though I could find it on the map, and I let myself be hurried along from minute to minute, day to day, year to year, as though I were actually year to year. minute to minute, day to day, year to year, as though I were actually moving from one place to another. Like everyone else, I lived in a house bricked up with seconds and minutes, weekends and New Year's days, and I never went outside until I died, because there were no other doors. There was no other door. Now I know that I could have walked through the walls. Molly blinked bewildered, but Schmendrick was nodding. Yes, he said. That's how the real magicians do it. But then the clock. The clock will never strike the right time, the skull said. Haggard scrambled the works long ago, one day when he was trying to grab hold of time as it was swinging by. But the important thing is for you to understand that it doesn't matter whether the clock strikes 10 next or 7 or 15 o'clock. You can strike your own time and start the countdown and start the count anywhere. When you understand that, then any time at all will be the right time for you. At that moment, the clock struck 4. The last bang had not yet faded when there came an answering sound from beneath the great hall. Neither a bellow nor a savage grumble that the Red Bull often made when he dreamed. It was a low, inquiring sound, as though the bull had awakened, sensing something new in the night. Every flagstone buzzed like a snake, and the darkness itself seemed to shudder as the glowing night creatures scampered wildly to the edge of the hall. Molly knew suddenly and surely that King Haggard was near. Give me the wine, the skull said. I've kept my part of the bargain. Silently, Schmendrick tipped the empty flask to the empty mouth, and the skull gurgled and sighed and smacked. Ah, it said at last. Ah, that was the real stuff. That was wine. You're more than a magician. You're more of a magician than I took you for. Do you understand me now about time? Yes, Schmendrick answered. I think so. The Red Bull made his curious sound again, and the skull rattled against the pillar. Schmendrick said, No. I don't know. Is there no other way? How can there be? Molly heard footsteps, then nothing, and then the thin, cautious ebb and flow of breathing. She could not tell where it came from. Schmendrick turned to her, and his face seemed to be smudged from within, like the inside of lantern glass, with fear and confusion. There was a light, too, but it shook like a lantern in a storm. I think I understand, he said, but I'm sure I don't. I'll try. We are going to finish this up. We're on page 138, and we are going to finish this up at a later time. Anyways, we have been reading from The Last Unicorn by Peter Beagle. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. And if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.